Maurice Demetz, or Doc to those who knew him, was an 84-year-old man from Colorado. He was a lifelong minister who held a PhD in theology. The arthritis in his knees made it nearly impossible to walk without assistance, and he also suffered from a blood condition. But the one thing that Doc refused to let his various ailments interfere with was his love of topaz hunting. He and a companion would go to various sites and spend hours cracking open small rocks in hope that they contained the mineral. A friend of Doc's named David McSherry accompanied Doc on many such outings. On April 29, 1981, Doc called up David, and the two of them headed to the Pike National Forest, to an area they frequently visited called Devil's Head. They arrived at 10 a.m. David helped Doc down a hill to his favorite dig site, left him and his bag of tools there, and then moved out about 150 feet away to his own dig site where they would remain for most of the day. Every now and then David would look over to check on Doc and, seeing everything was okay, continued to dig. At around 3 p.m., David walked over to Doc and told him it was time to be heading back. He then returned to his dig site, cleaned up his tools and collected his rocks, and about 15 minutes later walked the 150 feet back over to Doc. But Doc wasn't there. David assumed that Doc was nearby, probably relieving himself behind a tree. In Doc's condition, he couldn't have wandered off far. At Doc's dig site, his bag of tools were also missing. There was no evidence of anything bad happening, no sign of a struggle, no blood, no nothing, just some rocks. So David walked up the hill to the vehicle, thinking that Doc somehow made it up the hill himself. But neither Doc nor his tools were there. David honked the horn a few times, but got no response. After walking up and down Rampart Range Road a few times yelling into the woods for Doc, finally a motorist drove up and David flagged them down. The motorist helped David search the immediate area, but Doc was nowhere to be found. By 11 p.m., search and rescue teams were on the ground. Hundreds of volunteer searchers and tracking dog teams combed the wilderness for a week before the search was finally called off. The case was reopened later in 1981 when Doc's wife wrote to then-Governor Lamb requesting authorities take another look at the case. She believed Doc had met foul play or had possibly been abducted. Authorities did reopen the case, but, after no new developments, Doc Demetz was declared legally dead in 1990. 9 years after he disappeared. Many believe that Doc's friend, David McSherry, played a major role. Did he do something to Doc? Murder, perhaps? If so, when did it happen and where are his remains? Searches of the area found no blood and no sign of a struggle. Had Doc even made it to the Pike National Forest as David McSherry claimed? Or was David telling the truth, and Doc and his tools just vanished into thin air, under circumstances beyond our understanding? On April 12, 1976, Stephen Thomas was a 19-year-old last-second addition to a group set to hike up Mount Marcy in New York State. His childhood friend Bruce Weaver had asked Stephen to come along to round out the group headed to the High Peaks Wilderness area. In addition to Stephen and Bruce, the other hikers were Mark Seymour, James Thackerberry, Ken Sherwood, and Robert Romley. With the exception of Bruce, Stephen didn't know any of the other climbers. Mount Marcy stands over 5,000 feet tall, making it the highest peak in New York State and one of the largest in the eastern United States. April is an especially difficult month for hikers in the Mount Marcy area due to the unpredictable weather. Even experienced hikers who do reach the summit can easily take a wrong turn and end up in a dangerous 50-foot snow dump known as the Panther Gorge. So on the morning the men left, Stephen's mother tried to talk him out of going, telling him it wasn't a good idea to hike with people he didn't know in one of the toughest months of the year. But Stephen, an experienced hiker, told her there was nothing to worry about and that he'd be back in a couple days. The trip didn't go well almost from the beginning. As Stephen got acquainted with the others in the group, he found he didn't really like them and found himself keeping to himself. As the men pushed on, by 3:30 that afternoon, they had made it to the lower plateau and could easily see the summit only about a mile away. By now the group were cold and wet, and everyone wanted to stay put, build a fire, rest, and tackle the last mile to the summit the following day. That is, everyone except Stephen Thomas. He didn't want to stop. As the other men set up their camp in the lower plateau, Stephen sat inside Bruce's tent, lit his portable stove to make tea, and look at his map. After a while, Stephen turned to Bruce and asked if he wanted to go for a walk up the path a short distance. Bruce, cold, wet, and tired, told him he'd rather take it easy here and make the final push in the morning. So Stephen just sat there, staring at the map. By this time it was quickly becoming dark, temperatures were plummeting, and the weather was turning for the worse. Then suddenly, Stephen told Bruce he was going to walk up the path a ways and that he'd be right back. Bruce tried getting Stephen to stay given the worsening weather. As Stephen was leaving the campsite, the others all tried to convince him it was a bad idea, but Stephen just shrugged them off and left the camp, wearing only a t-shirt and jeans with a thin yellow rain jacket, hardly adequate for the deteriorating temperature and conditions. He left behind his pack, snowshoes, compass, and map, carrying only a knife. The snow was hard packed at that time of year, making for a relatively easy walk. The rest of the group weren't happy with Stephen's decision to leave the camp alone, but Bruce told them that Stephen had extensive hiking experience and that since he said he'd be back in a few minutes, there really wasn't any reason to doubt him. But when 10 o'clock came and Stephen still hadn't returned, worry turned to near panic. Knowing that Stephen couldn't survive a night out there given how he was dressed, Robert and Bruce geared up and walked up the trail with flashlights, battling what was now 50 to 60 mile-an-hour wind gusts and a wind chill of -40. After not finding Stephen, they made a wrong turn on their way back to camp, although they eventually did find their way back. At this point, all they could do was pray that Stephen had somewhere found shelter for the night. One of the hikers, it's unclear which one, brought along his dog on the trip, which apparently he always did. The dog, always full of energy, took any chance it could to get out and run around. But strangely, when the hikers were gearing up to go look for Stephen, the dog refused to leave the tent, cowering at the back as if it was frightened of something outside. The owner said he had never seen this behavior from the dog before. So at first light, everyone geared up and set out up the trail to look for Stephen. By this time, all the footprints from last night had been covered. 3 of the hikers ended up breaking off from the group and hiked for hours down the mountain to notify the authorities. The remaining members of the group stayed close to the camp, just in case Stephen somehow was able to make his way back. Once authorities got to the area, they launched one of the largest search and rescue operations up to that point in New York State. Helicopters, tracking dog teams, and ground searchers looked everywhere. No trace of Stephen Thomas was found. After combing the mountain for 2 weeks, authorities had to terminate the official search. Shortly after, Stephen's 26-year-old brother Bob quit his job and moved to the Mount Marcy area. He spent an entire year searching every square inch of Mount Marcy for any clues, and estimates he covered over 2,500 miles. Many of the senior park rangers would often joke that Bob knew the mountain better than they did. Although he was unable to locate his brother, Bob did find the remains of a hiker who had gone missing 3 years earlier. Why did Stephen think it so important that he reach the summit that night when he simply could have waited and gone with the group in the morning in better conditions? What frightened the normally energetic, outdoor-loving dog so much that it cowered at the back of the tent, refusing to come out? How could Bob, in his extensive year-long search of Mount Marcy, not find the remains of his brother, who was wearing a bright yellow rain jacket when he vanished? Or is it possible that Stephen Thomas, or his remains, aren't on Mount Marcy at all? But if he's not there, where is he? Somewhere out in the Sierra Nevada mountains lies a small hunting camp built in the 1950s. Only a small select group of people know exactly where this camp is. In the event one were to stumble upon it, unless you knew what you were looking for, you'd probably pass right by it. It's said to be tucked about 8 miles back into the wilderness through extremely rugged terrain near the top of a mountain at an elevation of 4,000 feet. According to the members of this camp, the fastest way into it is by horseback. The route back into this camp changes nearly every year due to fallen trees and the changes in topography. Ron Moorhead, one of the original camp members, had absolutely no issues with keeping the camp's location secret, but he felt it was no longer an option after the events that took place there in the fall of 1971. Ron Moorhead was invited to the camp earlier that year by the 3 original members. Ron was taken aback by the utter beauty of the area. Untouched wilderness, white fir trees surrounding them, the nearby fresh water streams, and the excellent hunting the area provided. The main concern was the bear population, but since the men were armed at all times while out there, this didn't bother them too much. The 3 original members had built a shelter between a couple of the large trees at the campsite, but the men normally stayed outside in tents. In the fall of 1971, the 4 men rode on horseback the 8 or so miles back into the camp. After a good day of hunting, they were back at camp, relaxing around the fire pit talking, when they began hearing grunting sounds back in the trees a short distance away. First thoughts were that a bear was nearby, so the men just listened for a few seconds to make sure before heading into the shelter. But what they heard next sent the men into the shelter right away. It was a whooping sound, unlike anything they had ever heard before, very loud. Then another, from another direction, different from the first, but yet eerily similar, obviously from 2 separate sources. At first, these sounds came from back in the forest a ways, but after a short time, the men could hear heavy footsteps running toward the camp from both directions. Just the sound of these running footsteps indicated at least 2 large animals. Peering through the slat walls of this shelter, with their campfire being the only source of light, the men huddled, horrified, until whatever these animals were reached the edge of the campsite, just inside the tree line and out of sight. Then the sounds changed. Instead of the whooping, these things began what can best be described as communicating in some sort of language. After listening to this for a few minutes, the frightened men heard these large creatures begin to circle the campsite, always staying inside the tree line out of sight until they were directly behind their shelter. Now the spaces between the slats of their shelter became the main concern. The men were afraid that one of these creatures would try to reach in and grab them. After hours of these creatures circling the camp, talking in this indiscernible language, they each let out a final whoop and very loudly moved back into the forest. Ron Moorhead and the other 3 men stayed where they were inside the shelter until first light, when they hurriedly packed up their belongings and rode out of the area. The men went back to their lives, and the incident was not mentioned. But Ron Moorhead wanted to find out once and for all what exactly surrounded their camp that night. So after some convincing, the other 3 men reluctantly agreed to go back into the Sierra camp with Ron Moorhead. Only this time, Ron brought a cassette recorder and intended to capture proof. So the men arrived at the camp and got settled in. After making a huge bonfire, they stood around, nervously waiting for what they knew was to come. Ron said that he heard heavy footsteps far back in the trees and they sounded like they were running toward the camp. So again, the men scrambled into their shelter, locked the door, and hit record on the tape recorder. This is what he captured.
We're in for Nightville. These ones like this. That's our job. Now we know where we look for tracks of life for sure. There's two of them across the creek at the big rocks. It's a hard act to follow.
It sounds like he talks to us and they talk to each other.
Yeah. Right there, I just seen movement right through there.
Ron took this recording to Dr. R. Lynn Curlin, an electrical engineering professor at the University of Wyoming, for analysis. Dr. Curlin and his team determined that the recording was authentic and had not been altered or doctored in any way. They also concluded that the audio captured could not be human, as the vocal range was both higher and lower than the human voice. Based on average pitch and track length, the creatures making these sounds were most likely between 7'3" and 8 foot tall. A cryptolinguist expert named Scott Nelson also noted that in 1971, using technology available at that time, it would have been nearly impossible for the four men to dub the sound of their voices over the sounds of the creatures, given the instances on the recording where they overlap. Today, the recording still stands as authentic and unaltered, although exactly what they recorded is still unknown. Ron Moorhead stopped hunting at the Sierra camp shortly after this incident, but he still occasionally goes out there, determined to figure out exactly what happened to him and his companions in the fall of 1971. In 2010, Eric Lewis was 57 years old and from Duvall, Washington. An experienced mountain climber as well as an experienced hiker, he had mountain climbed all over the world. Numerous reports have said that he had climbed Mount Rainier as many as 10 times in the past. On July 1st, 2010, Lewis and two close friends were ascending Mount Rainier, Eric being the most experienced of the three. They left from Camp Muir, a popular stop at 10,200 feet for climbers preparing to make their final ascent to the summit. Eric was in the rear, or number 3 position for the final push behind his two friends, Don Storm and Trevor Lane. Weather conditions were good when they set out, but deteriorated as the day went on, with high winds and reduced visibility. The weather had become troublesome enough that other climbers decided to sit tight and wait for conditions to improve. The three men traveled along the Gibraltar Ledges, a more difficult but more direct route to the summit. The lead climber would trudge forward and upward for a distance, then use the rope all three men were attached to help the others up to his level. Using this method, They were making decent progress. When the group reached 13,900 feet, Don, who was in the lead or number 1 position, stopped to take a break. He and Trevor, who was in the middle or number 2 position, were using the rope to help Eric up when they found that the rope was slack. Pulling the rope all the way up, they found it was coiled, knotted, and cut. Eric Lewis was not attached to it. Both men reported that they had seen Eric still attached to the rope only moments earlier. Don and Trevor cautiously descended to where they had last seen Eric, but all they found was their footprints leading up the mountain. Eric's footprints stopped where the 2 men had last seen him. Thinking perhaps that he had skirted around and continued to the summit ahead of them, Don and Trevor themselves continued up to the summit. Reaching the summit ridge, it was obvious that Eric hadn't been there. No footprints were found at the top indicating he had made it. Descending as quickly and safely as possible, the 2 men headed back to Camp Muir and notified park rangers. A ranger headed up to the summit with 2 guides to search, their main concern being that Eric Lewis was traveling without a sleeping bag or supplies for an extended stay out in the elements. After finding no trace of Eric, the 3 men descended and sought additional help. The next morning, over 40 mountain climbers from the National Park Service, guides from Alpine Ascents International, and volunteers from Olympic Mountain Rescue started a more expansive search with the assistance of several helicopters from the U.S. Army at Fort Lewis, now known as Joint Base Lewis-McChord. The climbers found Eric's pack at 13,600 feet, which held his climbing harness, drinking water, and shovel. 200 feet above, at 13,800 feet, a snow cave was found, but with no one in it, although searchers believe that Eric built it. From his last known position, the area where the pack and snow cave were found would have been very difficult if not impossible to reach. Strangely, no footprints were found in or near the cave or the pack. Search teams could find no evidence of a fall. By the end of the 3rd day, searchers had gone over the entire search perimeter with nothing additional found. Given his lack of supplies, authorities believed that Eric Lewis was most likely already deceased somewhere on the mountain. Investigators had to balance the risk inherent to the search teams against the likelihood of locating Eric Lewis's remains. To date, his remains have not been recovered. What made Eric Lewis cut his safety rope? Did he see something? Was he in some sort of trouble serious enough to warrant cutting the rope to save his companions? One would think that being an experienced climber, the last thing he would do is cut the rope unless it was absolutely necessary. Sam Duvall was 33 years old and an avid hiker who had been taking hiking trips all over the United States as well as the Himalayas. He had attended medical school at Harvard and had a PhD in medical anthropology from UC Berkeley. At the time of his disappearance, he was an assistant professor in the anthropology department at the University of Washington. The university considered themselves lucky to have Sam on staff, and he was well liked and respected by his colleagues. On October 9, 2020, Sam set off on an overnight hiking trip in Mount Rainier National Park and would be hiking the 17-mile Mother Mountain Loop Trail. He had been spotted that day on the trail near Lake Mulch. Sam was well prepared, bringing his phone, rain and snow gear, tent, and sleeping bag. The next day, October 10th, he didn't return as expected, and the official missing persons report was made on the 12th. At the time of his disappearance, he was 5'9" and weighed about 155 pounds. Search and rescue teams immediately hit the ground in the area of the Mother Mountain Loop Trail, then fanned out in the surrounding areas in all directions in a search effort that lasted 9 days through rugged wilderness, dense forests, and subalpine meadows at elevations ranging from 2,000 to 5,000 feet. Search teams from the National Park Service, volunteers, Air Force helicopters with thermal imaging capabilities, and tracking dog teams all participated. For extremely hard-to-reach areas, drones were used. The only piece of evidence found was early on in the search where a water bottle believed to be Sam's was found. Search teams had decent weather for most of their time on the ground, but when the weather did turn, They encountered heavy snowfall with low visibility and 50-plus mile-an-hour winds. The National Park Service intended to terminate the search on October 22nd, but at the urging of Sam's family, committed to continue for 72 more hours. But severe weather moved into the search area, and the teams were unable to continue. At that point, Dr. Sam Duvall was presumed dead. John Devine was a 73-year-old man who lived about 30 miles from Olympic National Park in Sequim, Washington. Despite his age and being legally blind in one eye, John was considered to be an experienced hiker who knew the Olympic National Park very well, having taken numerous long-distance hikes there over the years. On Friday, September 6, 1997, John left for what he had planned to be a 2-day hike in the park. He planned to hike up Mount Baldy at an elevation of over 5,000 feet using the Maynard Burn Trail, which was particularly steep and rugged. The next afternoon, September 7th, he was spotted along the Gray Wolf Ridge on the north side of the park. What was odd was that, from the witness accounts, John had no gear of any kind with him. An experienced hiker like John would have, or should have been carrying supplies, especially since he had planned to overnight in the park. Overnight temperatures in the Pacific Northwest at that time of year can drop into the 40s if not lower, and at least a sleeping bag would have been considered essential. John was supposed to meet up with his family later on September 7th. He never arrived. Authorities were immediately notified, and the Clallam County Sheriff's Office coordinated search efforts with the National Park Service. Over the next week, conditions steadily deteriorated as snow and bitter cold swept through the area. A Bell 205A1, one of the helicopters used to assist with the search, crashed into the side of Mount Baldy, killing 3 and injuring 5. On September 13th, 6 days after the search began, authorities were forced to terminate the search effort. No trace of John Devine has ever been found. Stefan Bissert was a 23-year-old exchange student from Germany attending Oregon State University. He and another German exchange student, Garrett Forsman, were hiking on the west side of the Olympic National Park in the Solduke Hot Springs area on January 20th, 1992. They were headed to Deer Lake, about 4 miles southwest of the hot springs. Stefan and Garrett somehow became separated, and Stefan decided on his own that he was going to make the 23-mile trek to the Hole River trailhead. Garrett, who had found his way to safety, reported Stefan missing on January 21st. Stefan took absolutely no gear with him, wearing only jeans and a shirt with a light windbreaker. He did carry a day pack which only contained a few pieces of fruit. Nothing he had with him prepared him for a long January night in the wilderness. Little did Stefan know that his planned route would lead him into some of the highest elevations in the park and into the teeth of a winter storm that lasted for a week. After he was reported missing, search teams including park rangers, mountain rescue teams, tracking dog teams, and helicopter assets scoured the area. Over 5 brutally tough days, the teams encountered rain, sleet, hail, snow, bitter cold, and the ever-present danger of avalanches. Search efforts proved unsuccessful, and to date the remains of Stefan Bissert have not been recovered. For more strange missing persons cases like this, make sure to check out this video. Thank you for watching, and we'll catch you next time.